Nothing cuts deeper than family, turning their backs on you when you need them most. When those who should protect you decide you're no longer worth keeping around, the world becomes a cold and dangerous place. Brynhild knew this pain well. Her husband's family had taken everything from her and left her to die in the snow. For 3 days, she wandered the frozen forest with nowhere to go. Then she saw smoke rising from a distant village and followed it, hoping for shelter. What she found changed everything. Hrolf Stenrsson, the giant Viking warrior everyone feared, had just burned down a cruel man's house. The villagers watched nervously as he walked straight to her. Without a word of explanation, he pointed to his warm home and said something that shocked everyone. But what could make the most dangerous warrior in Frostgard offer protection to a powerless widow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron ring on Brynhild's finger had grown loose over the winter months. She twisted it absently as she stood at the edge of the village, watching the flames dance against the evening sky. The ring had been her husband's gift on their wedding day. 43 years past, a simple band forged by his own hands when they were both young and believed love could conquer the harshness of the northern lands. Now, it served as her only remaining proof that she had once belonged somewhere. The village of Bjornheim stretched before her like something from a half-remembered dream. Wooden houses with carved dragon heads lined the central path, their windows glowing amber in the firelight. She had heard stories of this place during her marriage, tales of Hrolf Stenrsson's hall, where warriors gathered and where justice was dispensed with an iron fist. But she had never imagined she would stand here as a beggar, clutching nothing but the clothes on her back and a wedding ring that no longer fit. The Jarl's house continued to burn behind her. Flames licked at the timber walls, sending sparks into the darkening sky like angry stars. The acrid smell of smoke mixed with something else, the scent of justice perhaps, though Brynhild had almost forgotten what that smelled like. She had watched from the tree line as Hrolf had calmly walked from the burning structure, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow. Even from a distance, she could see the deliberate way he moved. No hurry, no panic, just the measured steps of a man who had done what needed doing. The villagers had emerged from their homes like cautious field mice, drawn by the spectacle but afraid to venture too close. They whispered among themselves, their voices carrying on the cold air. She caught fragments of their conversations, words like "finally" and "long overdue," mixed with nervous speculation about what would happen next. The Jarl who had lived in that house was not mourned. That much was clear. Hrolf had noticed her immediately. Perhaps it was the way she stood apart from the others, or perhaps it was simply that strangers were rare in Bjornheim. His pale blue eyes had found hers across the distance, and for a moment that stretched like the longest day of summer, they had simply looked at each other. She had expected anger, or at least suspicion. Instead, she saw something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not name. Recognition, not of her face, but of her situation, of what it meant to stand alone in the world with nowhere to go. "You're home now," he had said, his voice carrying clearly through the winter air. The words had been spoken matter-of-factly, as if he were commenting on the weather or the quality of the day's catch. But they hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and bringing tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with the smoke. Home. She had not had a home for 3 months now. Not since Magnus had died, and his brother Olaf had decided that a childless widow was more burden than asset. The conversation had been brief and brutal. She could take what she could carry, and she had until the next morning to be gone. When she'd tried to speak of the law, of the protection owed to a dead man's wife, Olaf had laughed. Laws were for those with sons to enforce them, he had said. She had neither sons nor silver to buy justice. Now this stranger, this giant of a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like thunder before lightning, offered her what her own blood had denied. The great hall stood behind Hrolf like a fortress carved from the living wood of ancient trees. Its roof soared high into the gathering darkness, supported by massive beams that spoke of old forests and older traditions. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady column, promising warmth and light and the kind of comfort she had not known since her husband's final breath. Through the open doors, she could see the flicker of hearth fire and the movement of people going about their evening tasks. "Come," Hrolf said, turning toward the hall without waiting for her response. His massive warhorse, a bay stallion with intelligent eyes and scars along its flanks that told of battles survived, stamped impatiently at the frozen ground. "The night grows cold, and there is hot food by the fire." Brynhild hesitated. Pride warred with desperation in her chest, two emotions she had become intimately familiar with during her months of wandering. Pride demanded that she refuse charity, that she find some way to pay for whatever kindness might be offered. Desperation whispered that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, that another night in the forest might well be her last. The villagers watched this exchange with unconcealed fascination. She could feel their eyes upon her, measuring and judging. Some faces showed sympathy, others mere curiosity. A few displayed the kind of calculating look that suggested they were already composing the stories they would tell about this night. The widow and the warrior. It would make for good telling around winter fires. A young woman emerged from the hall shadows, moving with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to managing large households. Her brown hair was braided with colored threads, and her dress spoke of prosperity without ostentation. She carried herself with quiet authority, her presence immediately commanding attention from the gathered villagers. "Astrid," Hrolf called to her without turning around. "See that a chamber is prepared. Our guest will need warm clothes and a proper meal." Astrid nodded once, her sharp eyes taking in Brynhild's bedraggled appearance with professional assessment rather than judgment. "The blue chamber, my lord. It catches the morning sun. The blue chamber will do well." The easy familiarity between them spoke of long partnership, though whether born of blood or service, Brynhild could not tell. Astrid disappeared back into the hall, already calling orders to unseen servants. Within moments, the sound of preparations could be heard, footsteps on wooden floors, the scrape of furniture being moved, voices coordinating tasks with practiced efficiency. Hrolf finally looked back at her, and she was struck again by the unexpected gentleness in his pale eyes. This was not the face of the berserker the stories described, the man who was said to fight with the fury of the old gods themselves. This was someone who understood what it meant to be lost, to stand at the edge of the world with nowhere left to go. "I have nothing to offer in return," she said, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. It was the admission that had haunted her for months, the recognition that she had become a burden rather than a contributor, a mouth to feed rather than hands to work. "You have more to offer than you know," Hrolf replied, swinging down from his horse with fluid grace despite his size. "But tonight offering is not required. Tonight you need only accept what is freely given." He handed the reins to a boy who appeared as if summoned, then stood waiting for her decision. The burning house crackled behind them, slowly collapsing in on itself as the flames consumed the last of its timber frame. The villagers continued to watch, but their attention was beginning to wander as the immediate spectacle faded. Soon they would return to their own hearths, their own concerns, leaving her to face this moment alone. Brynhild looked down at her hands, at the loose iron ring that caught the firelight. Magnus would have wanted her to live, she knew. He would have been furious at his brother's treatment of her, would have challenged Olaf to single combat for the insult if death had not claimed him first. But Magnus was gone, and she was here, faced with a choice that would define whatever remained of her life. She could refuse Hrolf's offer, could walk back into the forest and continue her wandering until the cold or the wolves claimed her. It would be a clean ending, perhaps, free from the complications of charity and the burden of obligation. Or she could follow this strange, gentle giant into his hall and discover what lay beyond the threshold of his generosity. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of snow and the certainty that winter had not finished with the land. Brynhild pulled her thin cloak tighter around her shoulders and made her choice. "Then I accept," she said, her voice stronger than she had expected. "And I thank you for your kindness to a stranger." Hrolf's smile transformed his face completely, revealing the man who lived beneath the warrior's reputation. "You're no stranger here, Brynhild Magnusdóttir. Your husband was known to me, and his honor lives on in his widow's courage." The use of her name shocked her. She had not given it, had not expected recognition in this place so far from her former home. But as Hrolf gestured toward the hall, she realized that perhaps her wandering had not been as random as she had believed. Perhaps her feet had been carrying her toward this moment all along, guided by forces she could not see but could finally trust. Together, they walked toward the great hall, leaving the burning house to collapse into ash and ember behind them. The villagers gradually dispersed, returning to their own homes with new stories to tell and new possibilities to consider. And Brynhild felt something she had thought lost forever, beginning to stir in her chest, the faint but growing warmth of hope. The blue chamber exceeded every expectation Brynhild had dared to harbor. Thick furs covered the wooden floor, their softness a revelation beneath her feet after months of sleeping on frozen ground. The bed was large enough for 3 people, piled high with woolen blankets dyed in shades of deep blue and forest green. But it was the small wooden chest at the foot of the bed that made her breath catch in her throat. Carved into its lid was the image of a raven in flight, its wings spread wide as if caught in the moment between earth and sky. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each feather rendered with loving detail. But more than its beauty, the chest radiated something else, a sense of waiting, as if it had been prepared for someone specific. For her. "It belonged to my grandmother," Astrid said from the doorway, her arms full of clean clothing. "She always said it would know its proper owner when the time came." Brynhild traced the raven's carved wing with one finger, feeling the smooth wood warm beneath her touch. "Your grandmother was wise in the old ways." "Wise in all ways," Astrid replied, setting the clothes on the bed. "She saw things others could not see, knew things before they happened. She carved that chest the year before she died, spent every winter evening working on it by the fire. When we asked who it was for, she would only smile and say we would understand when the time came." The implications of this revelation settled over Brynhild like a heavy cloak. If Hrolf's grandmother had foreseen her arrival, if this chamber had been prepared for her specifically, then her presence here was not the random act of charity she had believed. There were patterns at work, threads of fate being woven by hands she could not see. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. A young servant girl entered, carrying a basin of warm water and clean linens. Behind her came 2 more servants bearing trays of food, thick stew, fragrant with herbs, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, and a clay jug that smelled of mulled wine. The servants worked with quiet efficiency, setting up a small table by the room's single window and arranging everything with care. "Lord Hrolf requests your presence in the great hall when you are ready," the first servant said with a respectful bow. "There are matters he wishes to discuss." After the servants departed, Brynhild found herself alone with luxury she had almost forgotten existed. The warm water felt like a blessing against her chapped skin. The clean clothes, a wool dress in deep brown, soft leather shoes, a woolen cloak lined with rabbit fur, fit as if they had been made for her. When she looked at herself in the polished bronze mirror mounted on the wall, she saw not the desperate wanderer who had stumbled into Bjornheim, but a woman of dignity and worth. The transformation was more than cosmetic. As she fastened the cloak with its simple iron brooch, she felt something shifting inside her chest. For months, she had defined herself by what she had lost, her home, her status, her place in the world. Now, looking at her reflection, she began to remember what she had always possessed, her intelligence, her strength, her capacity for wisdom, born of experience. The great hall buzzed with evening activity when she descended the wooden stairs. Warriors sat at long tables, sharing meals and stories from the day's training. Servants moved between them with platters of food and pitchers of ale. The massive hearth dominated one end of the hall, its flames casting dancing shadows on the carved beams that supported the roof. The air was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter. Hrolf sat at the high table, but not in the ornate chair that clearly served as the seat of honor. Instead, he occupied a simpler chair to its right, leaving the place of greatest importance vacant. When he saw her approaching, he rose and gestured to the empty seat beside him. Not the throne-like chair, but a comfortable seat at his right hand. "You look well rested," he said as she took her place. "The blue chamber suits you. It is more luxury than I have known in many months," she replied honestly. "Your hospitality is beyond generous." Hrolf's expression grew serious. "It is not hospitality, Brynhild. It is recognition. You see, I knew your husband well. Magnus and I fought together in 3 campaigns, stood shield to shield against enemies who sought to destroy everything we held dear. He saved my life more than once, and I saved his. We were sworn brothers in all but blood." The words hit her like a physical blow. Magnus had spoken of a sworn brother, a warrior whose courage in battle was matched only by his loyalty to his friends. But he had never mentioned the man's name, and she had assumed this brother lived too far away to matter in their daily lives. "He never told me," she whispered. "Because I asked him not to," Hrolf said. "After my wife died, after my children were taken by the fever, I withdrew from the world. I became the monster the stories describe, dangerous, unpredictable, someone to be feared rather than befriended. I thought it was better if Magnus could speak of his family without having to explain his association with me." The revelation recontextualized everything. His recognition of her, his immediate offer of shelter, the prepared chamber. This was not charity or even simple kindness. This was obligation, the honoring of bonds forged in blood and battle. "When Magnus died," Hrolf continued, "I should have been there. I should have ensured you were protected, that his brother honored the law and his memory. Instead, I was lost in my own grief, too proud and too bitter to maintain the connections that might have served you well. Your suffering is partly my fault." Brynhild felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. Magnus chose his own path. His brother's choices were his own as well. "You bear no responsibility for either." "Perhaps not," Hrolf said. "But I bear responsibility for what happens next. I have spoken with several of the village elders today, and we are in agreement. There is a position here that needs filling, one that requires wisdom, discretion, and the kind of authority that comes from living a full life. We need a hallkeeper, someone to manage the household, oversee the servants, and serve as counselor when difficult decisions must be made." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm. Brynhild stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would trust me with such responsibility?" "I would trust Magnus's widow with such responsibility," Hrolf replied. "But more than that, I would trust the woman who walked through 3 days of winter forest and still maintained her dignity. I would trust someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still find the strength to begin again." Around them, the hall continued its evening rhythm, but Brynhild felt as if she and Hrolf were suspended in a bubble of significant silence. The offer was more than employment, it was restoration. It was a chance to be useful again, to have purpose beyond mere survival. But it was also a test, she realized. Hrolf was taking a risk by offering her such a position. If she failed, if she proved unworthy of his trust, it would reflect badly on his judgment and his leadership. "What of your current hallkeeper?" she asked. "Astrid has managed well," Hrolf said, "but she has her own family to consider now. Her husband farms land to the south, and they have been apart too long. She deserves the chance to build her own household, to raise her children in her own home, rather than always serving in mine." Brynhild looked across the hall to where Astrid was directing servants in clearing the evening meal. The young woman moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something in her posture that spoke of weariness, of duty performed without joy. As if sensing her gaze, Astrid looked up and smiled, an expression that held both welcome and relief. She knew, Brynhild said, understanding flooding through her. She knew this was why you brought me here. Astrid has something of her grandmother's sight, Hrolf confirmed. She has been preparing for this transition longer than either of us realized. The carved chest in her chamber suddenly made sense. Not just a gift for a guest, but a symbol of inheritance, of responsibility passing from one generation to the next. The raven on its lid was not just decoration, it was a sign of wisdom, of the kind of deep sight that came from observing the world with patient eyes. I accept, Brynhild said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. But I have one condition. Hrolf raised an eyebrow. Name it. I will not be kept woman or decorative appointment. If I am to be hallkeeper, then I will truly keep this hall. I will make decisions as I see fit, speak counsel as I deem necessary, and expect to be heard when I speak. I have lived too long and lost too much to accept a position of powerless ceremony. For a moment, Hrolf simply stared at her. Then slowly a smile spread across his face, not the gentle expression she had seen earlier, but something fiercer, more approving. Now I hear Magnus in your voice, he said. He always said his wife had the heart of a warrior and the wisdom of a seer. I begin to understand what he meant. He raised his drinking horn, and the gesture was noted by others in the hall. Conversations quieted as attention focused on the high table. To Brynhild Magnusdottir, Hrolf announced, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. Hallkeeper of Bjornheim, counselor to its lord, and honored friend to this house. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Drinking horns and cups rose throughout the hall, voices joining in acceptance and welcome. For the first time in months, Brynhild felt the warmth of belonging, the sense of being valued not for what she could provide, but for who she was. The inciting incident of her new life had begun. The morning brought challenges Brynhild had not anticipated. She woke before dawn, a habit ingrained by months of sleeping rough, and found the carved raven chest waiting at the foot of her bed like a silent guardian. Inside, she discovered not just storage space, but a collection of items that spoke to the depth of Astrid's preparation. Rolls of parchment for keeping household records, a set of keys to various storerooms, and most surprisingly, a small leather pouch containing silver coins for immediate household needs, Astrid explained when Brynhild questioned her about it over the morning meal. The markets open early, and there are supplies we'll need for the week ahead. I thought you might want to choose them yourself, to get a sense of the quality our usual traders provide. It was a tactful way of giving Brynhild authority while providing her with the information she would need to exercise it wisely. As they walked through the bustling market square, Astrid pointed out the reliable vendors, the ones who tried to pass off inferior goods at premium prices, and the seasonal availability of various supplies. The market was larger than Brynhild had expected, drawing traders from villages throughout the region who came to sell their wares in the shadow of Hrolf's protection. Lord Hrolf encourages trade, Astrid explained, as they examined bolts of cloth at a weaver's stall. He believes a prosperous village serves everyone's interests better than one that struggles to survive. The traders know they'll find fair dealing here, and they spread word to others. The weaver, a middle-aged woman with keen eyes and work-roughened hands, looked up from her loom as they approached. Astrid, and you must be the new hallkeeper I've been hearing about. Welcome to Bjornheim, lady. I'm Sigrid. Thank you, Brynhild replied, examining the quality of the woman's work. The weaving was excellent, tight, even stitches in patterns that spoke of both skill and artistic vision. This is beautiful craftsmanship, Sigrid beamed at the praise. My grandmother taught me the old patterns, the ones that tell stories in their threads. This one here is the saga of the winter wolf. See how the dark lines curve through the lighter ones. It's said to bring protection to households during the cold months. Brynhild traced the pattern with her finger, feeling the story Sigrid described. There was something comforting about the continuity it represented. Knowledge passed down through generations, traditions maintained despite the chaos of individual lives. I'll take enough for new wall hangings in the Great Hall. The current ones are showing their age. It was a significant purchase, one that would demonstrate her authority to make decisions about the hall's appearance and comfort. Astrid nodded approvingly as Sigrid began measuring out the requested length of cloth. "The hall has needed refreshing for some time," Astrid said quietly. "Lord Hrolf tends to focus on practical matters, weapons, fortifications, training. He's less attentive to the details that make a house feel like a home." Their next stop was the baker's stall, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the sweeter aromas of honey cakes and fruit pastries. The baker, a stout man with flour-dusted aprons and a cheerful demeanor, greeted them warmly. "Astrid, and the new hallkeeper, Brynhild, isn't it? I'm Eric Flowerhand. My ovens stand ready to serve the great hall, as they have these past 10 years. Brynhild sampled the bread he offered, dense, dark, with a hearty flavor that spoke of quality grain and careful preparation. "This is excellent. What grains do you use?" "Barley and rye, mostly, with some wheat when the southern traders bring it through. I've found the mixture holds up better through the winter months. Keeps people fed when fresh food grows scarce." It was practical thinking, the kind of long-term planning that separated successful households from those that struggled through lean times. Brynhild made mental notes about seasonal supply patterns, storage requirements, and the relationships between various traders. Being hallkeeper would require understanding not just the immediate needs of Hrolf's household, but the complex web of dependencies that sustained the entire community. As they continued through the market, Brynhild began to sense an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with her presence. Conversations would quiet when certain individuals passed, and she noticed how some traders would glance nervously toward the road that led north from the village. When she asked Astrid about it, the younger woman's expression grew troubled. "There have been rumors," Astrid said quietly. "Riders seen on the northern roads, strangers asking questions in distant villages. Some say they wear the colors of Jarl Thorkel, Magnus's brother-in-law." The name hit Brynhild like a physical blow. Thorkel was Olaf's ally, a man known for his cruelty and his long memory for slights. If he had learned of her presence in Bjornheim, if he saw her newfound position as some kind of challenge to the authority he had helped Olaf exercise over her former home, then her sanctuary might not be as secure as she had hoped. "What kind of questions?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "About you, mostly. Your appearance, your destination, whether anyone had offered you shelter." The traders who've spoken with these riders say they seem particularly interested in any connections you might have to powerful households. Brynhild felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had hoped that her exile would be the end of the matter, that Olaf and his allies would be content with taking her property and driving her away. But if they saw her presence in Hrolf's hall as some kind of threat to their actions, they might feel compelled to act against her or against those who sheltered her. "Does Lord Hrolf know about these riders?" she asked. "Not yet," Astrid replied. "The reports only reached us yesterday, and you know how he is about unconfirmed rumors. He prefers to wait for solid information before taking action." It was a reasonable approach under normal circumstances, but Brynhild knew Thorkel's reputation well enough to understand that waiting might not be wise. The man was cunning as well as cruel, capable of stirring up trouble while maintaining the appearance of innocent inquiry. If he was indeed seeking her, then her presence was already putting Hrolf and his people at risk. They completed their market rounds in subdued silence, each lost in thoughts about the implications of the morning's revelation. When they returned to the hall, Brynhild found Hrolf in the training yard, working with a group of young warriors on sword techniques. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he demonstrated proper stance and blade work, his voice carrying clearly as he corrected form and encouraged effort. Watching him, Brynhild was reminded again of the contradiction he represented, the gentle giant who had offered her shelter, and the feared warrior whose reputation for violence preceded him. Both aspects were real, she realized. Both were necessary for survival in their harsh world. "My lord," she called when the training session paused, "when you have a moment, there are matters we should discuss." Hrolf looked up, his pale eyes immediately focusing on the tension in her posture. Of course. Eric, continue the drills. Focus on the combinations we practiced yesterday. As they walked toward the hall, Brynhild found herself gripping the iron keys that marked her new authority. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever threats might be gathering on the northern roads, she would face them as Hall-keeper of Bjornheim. She had accepted the position knowing it would bring responsibilities as well as privileges. Now she would discover just how heavy those responsibilities might prove to be. The carved raven chest had contained more than household supplies and silver coins. It had contained the first test of her resolve, and the beginning of conflicts she was only starting to understand. The conversation with Hrolf took place in his private study, a smaller chamber behind the great hall where he conducted the serious business of leadership. Maps covered one wall, marking trade routes, alliance territories, and potential threats. A heavy oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred by years of use and scattered with correspondence from neighboring jarls and village headmen. Brynhild placed the leather message pouch she carried on the table between them. Inside were the detailed reports Astrid had gathered about the mysterious riders, along with her own careful analysis of what the information might mean. Thorkel moves carefully, she explained as Hrolf read through the documents. He's not foolish enough to make direct accusations or open threats. Instead, he'll gather information, build a case, and then present himself as a defender of proper order when he finally acts. Hrolf's expression grew darker as he absorbed the implications. What kind of case could he possibly build? You committed no crime. Your husband's property legally passed to his family, and they chose to exercise their rights, harshly perhaps, but within the bounds of tradition. The case wouldn't be against me, Brynhild said quietly. It would be against you. Thorkel could claim that by taking me in, by giving me a position of authority, you're challenging the legitimacy of Olaf's actions. He could frame it as interference in family matters or as an attempt to undermine the established order. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Both of them understood the delicate balance that governed relationships between powerful men in their world. A jarl's authority depended not just on strength, but on the perception that he respected traditional boundaries and customs. If Thorkel could make a convincing argument that Hrolf had overstepped those boundaries, he might be able to rally support from other leaders who feared similar interference in their own affairs. There's more, Brynhild continued, her voice steady, despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. I've been thinking about the timing of these inquiries. They began just days after I arrived here, which means Thorkel was watching my movements even during my exile. He knew where I was going before I knew it myself. Hrolf leaned back in his chair, his massive frame making the sturdy furniture creak. That suggests planning beyond simple curiosity. He wanted you to end up somewhere he could use your presence to his advantage. Or he wanted to ensure I didn't find sanctuary at all, Brynhild said. Think about it. If I had died in the forest, if I had simply disappeared, there would be no questions about the treatment I received. No one to challenge the story that I left willingly or that my exile was somehow justified. The implications of this possibility hung between them like a sword on a fraying rope. If Thorkel had indeed been tracking her movements, if he had been prepared to use her presence wherever she might find shelter, then her arrival in Bjornheim had not been the escape she had believed. It had been the next move in a game she was only beginning to understand. A soft knock at the study door interrupted their deliberations. At Hrolf's call, Astrid entered carrying a tray with steaming bowls of stew and chunks of fresh bread. Behind her came Eric, the young warrior who had been leading sword practice earlier, his face flushed with exertion and urgency. "My lord," Eric said with a quick bow. Riders approaching from the north. 3 men, well-armed, flying Jarl Thorkel's banner. Brynhild felt her stomach clench, but Hrolf's expression remained calm. "How far out?" "Perhaps an hour's ride, my lord." "They're not pushing their horses hard. They want to be seen approaching." "As expected," Hrolf murmured. "Thank you, Eric. Have the men continue their training as normal, but ensure weapons are close at hand." And ask Gunnar to join us here. We'll want his counsel for what's to come." Eric departed swiftly, leaving Astrid to set the food on the table. The young woman's face was pale, but her movements remained steady and efficient. "Should I prepare guest chambers?" she asked. "Not yet," Hrolf replied. "Let's first discover the nature of their visit." After Astrid left, Hrolf turned his attention back to Brynhild. "This moves faster than I anticipated, but not faster than we can handle. The question is what role you wish to play in what comes next." Brynhild considered her options carefully. She could remain hidden, allow Hrolf to handle the situation without her presence complicating matters. It would be the safe choice, the one that protected both herself and her newfound sanctuary. But it would also be an abdication of the responsibility she had accepted when she became hallkeeper. "I'll stand with you," she said finally. "If Thorkel has come here because of me, then hiding would only confirm whatever accusations he plans to make. Besides, I know these men better than you do. I may be able to anticipate their tactics." Hrolf nodded approvingly. "Good, but we'll need to be careful about how we present your position here. Too much authority too quickly might feed into whatever narrative Thorkel is constructing." Before Brynhild could respond, the study door opened again to admit Gunnar Ironhand, Hrolf's chief advisor and oldest friend. Gunnar was a man of middle years, grey-bearded and weathered, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from surviving decades of political maneuvering in a world where the wrong word could mean death. "Eric told me about our visitors," Gunnar said without preamble. "Thorkel's men, you said? That's interesting timing, given our new hallkeeper's recent arrival." "More than interesting," Hrolf replied, gesturing for Gunnar to take a seat. "We believe the timing is deliberate, and Brynhild has been sharing her insights about Thorkel's likely motivations." Gunnar's keen eyes fixed on Brynhild with new attention. "And what do those insights suggest about how we should handle his representatives?" Carefully," Brynhild said. "Thorkel will have instructed them to gather information while presenting themselves as bringing friendly greetings or routine business. They'll be polite, respectful, and seemingly innocent in their inquiries. But every word will be chosen to either gather intelligence or provoke a response that can be used against us later." "Classic approach," Gunnar agreed. "So we respond with equal courtesy and equal caution. We give them nothing to work with while demonstrating that we're not intimidated by their presence." "There's something else to consider," Brynhild added. "These 3 riders are just the advance party. If Thorkel is planning something significant, he'll have more men positioned nearby, ready to respond to whatever his representatives discover here." Hrolf and Gunnar exchanged glances, both recognizing the strategic implications. If larger forces were indeed waiting in the area, any misstep during the coming meeting could escalate quickly beyond diplomatic maneuvering into something far more dangerous. "Then we'd best ensure there are no missteps," Hrolf said grimly. "Gunnar, have our scouts check the surrounding area quietly. I want to know if we're dealing with 3 visitors or 30. As Gunnar rose to carry out his orders, Brynhild felt the weight of the iron keys at her belt. She had accepted the position of hallkeeper, believing it would offer her safety and purpose. Now she was discovering that both came with a price she was only beginning to calculate. The 3 riders entered Bjornheim with the measured confidence of men who knew they held strong cards in a dangerous game. They wore well-crafted mail beneath traveling cloaks, and their horses were quality animals bred for both speed and endurance. Their leader, a lean man with calculating eyes and a carefully groomed beard, dismounted with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to making impressive entrances. Brynhild watched from the hall's upper windows as Hrolf greeted the visitors in the courtyard below. She wore a simple bronze brooch at her shoulder, her grandmother's piece, the last family heirloom she possessed, that marked her as a woman of standing without proclaiming her specific role. The brooch had been crafted in the old style, its surface etched with intertwining serpents that seemed to move in the shifting light. "I am Bjorn Ravenson," the lead rider announced, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I bring greetings from Jarl Thorkel and news from the Eastern Territories." Hrolf's response was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to demonstrate proper hospitality, neutral enough to avoid committing to anything specific. "Welcome to Bjornheim, Bjorn Ravensson. You and your men must be tired from the road. Come, there's warm food and good ale waiting." The ritual of welcome proceeded according to ancient custom. Hrolf offered bread and salt, symbols of protection and hospitality that bound both host and guest to certain codes of behavior. Bjorn accepted with appropriate ceremony, but Brynhild could see the predatory intelligence behind his courteous manner. This was a man who understood the letter of tradition while remaining perfectly willing to exploit its spirit. As the visitors were settled at a table in the great hall, Brynhild made her entrance. She descended the stairs with deliberate dignity, carrying herself with the authority of her position, while maintaining the careful balance between visibility and modesty that the situation required. Conversations quieted as she appeared, and she felt the weight of numerous gazes, measuring her appearance and trying to divine her significance. "Bjorn Ravensson," Hrolf said as she approached, "allow me to present Brynhild Magnusdotter, keeper of this hall, an honored member of our household." The introduction was masterfully crafted. It acknowledged her position without overemphasizing it, mentioned her lineage without dwelling on recent troubles, and established her presence as legitimate without inviting challenge. Bjorn rose and offered a respectful bow, but Brynhild caught the sharp interest in his eyes as he processed both her identity and her apparent status. "Lady Brynhild," Bjorn said smoothly, "your reputation for wisdom preceded you, though I confess I had not expected to find you so far from your former home. It was a skillful probe, designed to seem like polite conversation, while actually testing how she would respond to indirect questions about her circumstances." Brynhild smiled graciously, giving no hint that she recognized the tactic. "Life has a way of leading us where we're needed most," she replied. "I find myself blessed to serve in a household that values experience and counsel." "Indeed," Bjorn agreed. "Jarl Thorkel often speaks of the importance of proper order in household management. He believes that when people find their appropriate places, everyone prospers." The comment was loaded with implication. By emphasizing proper order and appropriate places, Bjorn was subtly suggesting that Brynhild's current position might not align with traditional expectations. It was the kind of statement that could be interpreted as innocent observation or veiled criticism, depending on the listener's perspective. Hrolf leaned back in his chair, his expression remaining pleasantly neutral. "And what news does Jarl Thorkel send from the Eastern Territories?" "We hear little from that direction during the winter months." Bjorn launched into a carefully prepared recitation of regional developments, trade disputes, boundary negotiations, rumors of raiders operating along the northern coasts. Most of the information was mundane, the kind of routine intelligence that Jarls typically shared to maintain cordial relationships. But woven throughout were subtle questions about Bjornheim's defenses, its alliances, and its current concerns. "We've heard reports of unusual activity in this region," Bjorn mentioned casually as the conversation progressed. "Riders moving along forest paths, strangers seeking shelter in villages that normally see few outsiders. Jarl Thorkel wonders if you've experienced any such disturbances." Brynhild felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained serene. "Winter often brings unexpected travelers," she said. "Those who find themselves far from home when the storms arrive must seek whatever shelter they can find. We try to extend hospitality to all who come in peace." "Admirable," Bjorn replied, "though sometimes strangers bring complications along with their need for shelter. Old disputes, family grievances, debts that follow them from place to place." The message was becoming clearer. Bjorn was letting them know that he understood exactly why Brynhild was in Bjornheim, and he was warning that her presence might bring unwanted consequences. It was a sophisticated form of intimidation, wrapped in the language of friendly concern. Gunnar chose that moment to make his entrance, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew his own worth. He had clearly been listening from the shadows, timing his appearance to maximum effect. "Forgive the interruption," Gunnar said, with a respectful nod to the visitors. "But there are matters requiring Lord Hrolf's attention when convenient." Hrolf gestured for Gunnar to approach. "Bjorn Ravenson, this is Gunnar Ironhand, my chief counsel. Perhaps you could share with him the news you've brought. He's always interested in developments throughout the region." As Gunnar took his seat, Brynhild noticed how the dynamic in the room shifted. The older man's presence added weight to their side of the conversation, suggesting that whatever Bjorn might be planning, he would be dealing with experienced opposition. More importantly, it demonstrated that Hrolf valued counsel and made decisions in consultation with trusted advisors, a clear signal that any attempts to manipulate or intimidate him would need to account for multiple perspectives. "Actually," Bjorn said, his tone becoming slightly more formal, "there was one specific matter Jarl Thorkel asked me to discuss. He's received reports that certain family disputes may have spread beyond their original boundaries, creating potential complications for neighboring territories. He wanted to ensure that no one has been placed in an awkward position through misunderstanding or misplaced sympathy." The careful language couldn't disguise the threat. Thorkel was making it clear that he considered Brynhild's presence in Bjornheim to be interference in family matters, and he was offering Hrolf a chance to step back from any potential conflict by removing that interference. Hrolf's response was equally measured. "I appreciate Jarl Thorkel's concern for maintaining proper relationships between households. However, the decisions made within Bjornheim are guided by our own understanding of honor and obligation. We would never presume to interfere in other families' affairs, just as we trust that others will respect our right to manage our own household as we see fit." It was a polite but firm rejection of Thorkel's implied demand. Hrolf was making it clear that he would not be pressured into abandoning Brynhild, while also establishing that he considered her presence a matter of internal household management, rather than external interference. Bjorn's smile became slightly strained, suggesting that this was not the response he had hoped to receive. But he maintained his diplomatic facade, nodding as if Hrolf's position was perfectly reasonable. "Of course," he said. "Jarl Thorkel simply wanted to ensure that all parties understood each other's positions clearly. Sometimes misunderstandings can escalate unnecessarily when communication is incomplete." The bronze brooch at Brynhild's shoulder seemed to grow warm against her skin, as if her grandmother's spirit was reminding her to remain strong in the face of threats. Whatever game Thorkel was playing, whatever pressure he planned to apply, she would not make it easy for him by showing fear or uncertainty. The evening meal became a careful dance of diplomatic chess, each course bringing new moves and counter-moves. Bjorn and his companions maintained their facade of friendly visitation, but their questions grew increasingly pointed as the wine flowed. They inquired about grain stores, winter preparations, and the loyalty of various village craftsmen, the kind of intelligence that would be valuable to someone planning either trade partnerships or military action. Brynhild excused herself after the main course, claiming household duties that required her attention. In truth, she needed time to think, to process what she had observed and plan for what might come next. She retreated to her chamber, where the carved raven chest waited like a silent counselor. Inside the chest, beneath the household records and silver coins, she found something she had not noticed before, a small scroll wrapped in oiled leather. Her hands trembled slightly as she unrolled it, revealing script in a familiar hand. It was a letter from Magnus, written in the months before his death, addressed to "my brother Hrolf," and sealed with wax that had been carefully preserved. The letter's contents made her sink onto the edge of the bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and revelation. "Brother, if you read this, then I am gone and Brynhild faces the world alone. I know your nature, and I know you will blame yourself for not being present when she needed protection. Do not carry that burden. Instead, know that I write this in the hope that fate will guide her to your door when all other paths have closed. She is stronger than she knows, wiser than she believes, and more capable than any man has ever allowed her to demonstrate. In our marriage, I was blessed to see glimpses of the leader she could become if given proper authority. The Hall-keeper's position would suit her well. She has the sight to see what others miss, the wisdom to counsel without overstepping, and the strength to make difficult decisions when they must be made. If she comes to you, if circumstances bring her to Bjornheim, know that it is not charity she needs, but opportunity. Give her responsibility, and she will transform your household. Give her trust, and she will prove worthy of it. Give her respect, and she will return it tenfold. Your sworn brother in this life and beyond, Magnus. The letter explained so much. Hrolf's immediate recognition of her worth, the prepared chamber, even Astrid's grandmother's prophetic chest. Magnus had foreseen the possibility of her exile, had arranged for her protection even from beyond the grave. But more than that, he had seen in her capabilities that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. "Come!" she called, quickly securing the letter back in its hiding place. Astrid entered, carrying a tray with herb tea and honey cakes. Her expression was troubled, and she moved with unusual hesitation. "The visitors have retired to their chambers," Astrid reported. "But I thought you should know. I overheard them talking when they thought no one was listening. They're planning to stay for several days, claiming they need to rest their horses and wait for better weather. But their horses looked fresh enough to travel, and the weather has been clear. They're gathering intelligence," Brynhild said, accepting the tea gratefully, "and probably waiting for additional forces to arrive in the area." "What else did you hear?" "They mentioned something about a message being sent to the others. I couldn't tell if they meant other riders or other jarls. And one of them said something about making sure the situation is resolved properly before spring. I think they're planning more than just diplomatic pressure." The implications were sobering. If Thorkel was indeed coordinating with other regional leaders, if he was planning to frame Brynhild's presence as part of some larger threat to traditional authority, then the danger was greater than they had anticipated. A coalition of jarls could bring far more pressure to bear than any individual leader. "There's something else," Astrid continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Gunnar's scouts returned while you were at dinner. There are at least 24 armed men camped in the forest, about an hour's ride north of here. They're flying no banners, but they're well equipped and organized like professional soldiers." Brynhild set down her teacup with careful control, though her mind was racing. 24 men was a significant force, not enough to assault Bjornheim directly, but more than enough to create serious problems if they chose to act. Their presence confirmed her worst suspicions about Thorkel's intentions. "Have you told Lord Hrolf?" "Gunnar was briefing him when I left to bring you this news. They're meeting in the study now, deciding how to respond." Brynhild stood, smoothing her dress and checking that the bronze brooch was properly positioned. "Then I should join them. This concerns me as much as anyone. Are you certain that's wise?" Astrid asked gently. "If the visitors see you involved in military planning, it might give them additional ammunition for whatever accusations they're preparing." It was a valid concern, but Brynhild had made her decision. Magnus's letter had reminded her of something she had been in danger of forgetting. She was not just a victim seeking shelter, but a capable woman with valuable insights to offer. If Thorkel wanted to use her presence as an excuse for conflict, then she would ensure that presence counted for something meaningful. "Let them make their accusations," she said firmly. "I've spent too many months running from confrontation. If there's to be a fight over my right to exist in peace, then I'll stand and face it properly." The study was thick with tension when she entered. Hrolf and Gunnar were bent over a map of the local area, marking positions and discussing defensive options. They looked up as she approached, their expressions mixing concern with something that might have been relief. "Astrid told you about the scout's report?" Hrolf asked. "She did, and I think I understand what we're facing." Brynhild moved to the map, studying the marked positions. "Thorkel isn't just trying to pressure you into abandoning me. He's creating a situation where he can justify whatever action he takes next. If you refuse his demands, he'll claim you're being unreasonable and forcing his hand. If you give in, he'll have established that he can dictate terms to other Jarls through intimidation. Gunnar nodded grimly. A win-win strategy for him. Either he gets what he wants immediately, or he gets justification for escalating the conflict. But there's a third option, Brynhild continued, her finger tracing routes on the map. We change the nature of the game entirely. Instead of responding to his pressure, we create pressure of our own. Hrolf looked up sharply. What do you have in mind? Information, Brynhild said simply. Thorkel's strategy depends on controlling the narrative, on being able to present his version of events to other Jarls before they hear alternatives. But what if we ensure they hear a different story first? She explained her thinking, outlining a plan that would require careful timing and considerable risk. It was ambitious, perhaps overly so, but it offered the possibility of turning Thorkel's own tactics against him. When she finished, the study fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Hrolf and Gunnar exchanged glances, each recognizing both the potential and the danger in what she proposed. It could work, Gunnar said slowly. But if it fails, if Thorkel anticipates our move, it could make things significantly worse. They're already worse, Brynhild replied. The men in the forest prove that. At least this way, we act from a position of choice, rather than simply reacting to whatever he does next. Hrolf stood slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows in the firelight. Then we'll try it. But we'll need to move quickly, and we'll need to be prepared for the consequences if things go wrong. The bronze brooch felt warm against Brynhild's shoulder, as if her grandmother's spirit approved of her decision to stop running and start fighting back. The plan they had devised was elegant in its simplicity. While Thorkel's men waited in the forest, and his representatives continued their diplomatic charade, Hrolf would dispatch his own messengers to neighboring Jarls with a very different version of recent events. They would present Brynhild's exile and Thorkel's subsequent maneuvering as evidence of a dangerous precedent, the use of family disputes to justify interference in other territories. If successful, it would isolate Thorkel politically before he could build the coalition he clearly sought. But at dawn, everything changed. The messenger who arrived at Bjornheim's gates rode a lathered horse and bore the colors of Jarl Erik Bloodaxe, one of the most powerful leaders in the northern territories. His news shattered their carefully laid plans and revealed the true scope of the game they were playing. Lord Hrolf, the messenger gasped, still breathing hard from his desperate ride. I bring urgent word from my master. Jarl Thorkel has petitioned the Assembly of Jarls, claiming that lawless elements in the Western Territories threaten the stability of traditional authority. He names you specifically as harboring criminals and defying proper order. Brynhild felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The Assembly of Jarls was the highest authority in their region, a council of the most powerful leaders that met only in times of serious crisis. A petition to the Assembly was not a private dispute between neighboring territories. It was a formal challenge that could result in anything from economic sanctions to military intervention. What specific charges has he made? Hrolf asked, his voice deadly calm. He claims you have given sanctuary to a woman who fled lawful judgment, that you have elevated her to a position of authority in defiance of her family's rights, and that you have refused reasonable requests to return her to proper custody. He presents this as evidence that you no longer respect traditional law and order. Gunnar cursed under his breath, but Brynhild's mind was racing beyond the immediate shock. Something about the messenger's report didn't align with what they knew of Thorkel's timeline. The petition would have taken weeks to prepare and submit properly, yet the representatives currently sleeping in their guest chambers had only arrived yesterday. When was this petition submitted? She asked. The messenger looked uncertain about addressing her directly, but Hrolf nodded for him to answer. 3 weeks past, my lady. The Assembly will convene in 5 days to hear the matter. 3 weeks. That meant Thorkel had begun his formal challenge before his men had even started making inquiries about her whereabouts. The riders they had detected, the diplomatic mission currently under their roof, none of it had been about gathering information or applying pressure. It had all been theatre, designed to create the appearance of reasonable efforts at negotiation before escalating to formal accusations. "He's been planning this from the beginning," Brynhild said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. The inquiries, the diplomatic visit, even my exile itself, it was all orchestrated to create this moment. Hrolf's pale eyes fixed on her with sudden intensity. "Explain. Think about the timing," she said, pacing to the window where she could see Thorkel's representatives emerging from the guest quarters for their morning meal. "My husband dies unexpectedly. Within weeks, his brother moves to seize my property and cast me out. But instead of simply taking what he wants and being done with it, he ensures I leave in a specific direction at a specific time, when his ally Thorkel is already preparing a petition against you." The implications were staggering. If her analysis was correct, then Magnus's death had not been the natural end to a long illness, but the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Her exile had not been the cruel but simple greed she had assumed, but a calculated move designed to create justification for a larger political attack. "You're suggesting they murdered your husband," Gunnar said quietly. "I'm suggesting they didn't need to," Brynhild replied, her voice hollow with realization. Magnus was already dying. They just had to wait and plan and ensure that when the time came, my exile would serve their purposes. The bronze brooch at her shoulder felt suddenly heavy, weighted with the memory of all the small signs she had missed. The eager way Olaf had moved to seize property, as if he had been prepared for months. The specific timing of her exile, designed to put her on the winter roads when travel was most dangerous. Even the direction she had been pointed toward territories where Thorkel held influence. "But why target me specifically?" Hrolf asked. "What threat do I pose that would justify such elaborate planning?" Before anyone could answer, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention to the window. Bjorn Ravenson and his companions were mounting their horses, their diplomatic mission apparently concluded. But instead of departing, they were being joined by additional riders, men emerging from the forest in groups of 3 and 4, no longer bothering to conceal their presence. "They're not leaving," Gunnar observed grimly. "They're consolidating." The messenger from Jarl Erik looked increasingly uncomfortable. "My lord, there's more. The Assembly has empowered Jarl Thorkel to take immediate action if he deems it necessary to preserve order. He has authority to act in the Assembly's name until the formal hearing can be held." It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. Thorkel had not only secured formal backing for his accusations, but had also obtained the authority to enforce his will immediately. The diplomatic niceties were over. The real confrontation was about to begin. "How many men does he have in the field?" Hrolf asked. "Reports vary, my lord. Perhaps 50, perhaps more. They've been gathering for days, positioned around the territory. 50 men against the 20 warriors currently in Bjornheim, with no time to summon additional forces." The military mathematics were stark, but Brynhild found herself thinking beyond the immediate tactical situation. There was still something that didn't make sense about Thorkel's strategy. "He's not here to fight," she said suddenly. "If he wanted to take Bjornheim by force, he wouldn't have needed the Assembly's authority or the elaborate political justification. 50 men could have attacked us at any time. Then what does he want?" Hrolf asked. "Legitimacy," Brynhild replied, understanding flooding through her. "He wants to be seen as the defender of proper order, the man who restored stability when traditional authority was challenged. If he can force you to surrender me voluntarily, if he can make it appear that even you recognize the justice of his cause, then he becomes the hero of this story." The sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard grew louder as more of Thorkel's men revealed themselves. Through the window, they could see Bjorn Ravenson organizing them into formation, not for immediate attack, but for an impressive display of force designed to underscore the hopelessness of resistance. "And if I refuse to surrender you?" Hrolf asked. Then he gets a different kind of legitimacy, Brynhild said grimly. The authority to use force against a Jarl who defied the Assembly's will. Either way, he wins. The messenger shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. My lord, Jarl Erik instructed me to offer his continued friendship, but he cannot oppose the Assembly's will. If you choose to resist Jarl Thorkel's authority, you will stand alone. It was the final piece of Thorkel's strategy. Isolate the target politically, then present them with an impossible choice. Surrender with dignity, or resist and be crushed with the full weight of legitimate authority. There is a third option, Brynhild said quietly, her hand moving to touch the bronze brooch that held so many memories. But it would require trusting me completely and accepting consequences that neither of us can fully anticipate. Hrolf turned from the window to face her directly. What do you propose? We give Thorkel exactly what he wants, she said. But we do it in a way that destroys everything he's worked to build. The carved raven chest in her chamber seemed to call to her, reminding her of the wisdom that had been passed down through generations of strong women who had faced impossible choices. Her grandmother's spirit, Magnus's faith in her capabilities, and her own hard-won understanding of survival all pointed toward the same conclusion. Sometimes the only way to win was to appear to lose completely. Explain, Hrolf commanded. I surrender myself to Thorkel's authority, Brynhild said, her voice growing stronger as the plan took shape in her mind. But I do it publicly, before witnesses from multiple territories, and I do it in a way that exposes the true nature of his ambitions. If I can turn his moment of triumph into a revelation of his methods, if I can make him overreach in front of the very people he's trying to impress, then his victory becomes his downfall. The room fell silent as Hrolf and Gunnar absorbed the implications of her proposal. It was audacious to the point of madness, requiring perfect timing and enormous personal risk. But it was also the one strategy that Thorkel would never expect. The one response that could turn his own careful planning against him. Outside, the sound of assembling warriors grew louder, and Brynhild knew their time for planning was running out. The plan required meticulous preparation in the few hours they had remaining. Brynhild retreated to her chamber to gather the tools she would need for what was to come, while Hrolf and Gunnar coordinated the delicate logistics of apparent surrender. The bronze brooch at her shoulder would need to be replaced with something that would serve her purposes better in the confrontation ahead. From the carved raven chest, she withdrew a small silver pendant, a piece that had belonged to Magnus's mother, bearing the intricate knotwork that told the story of their family's lineage. More importantly, it contained a hidden compartment where important documents had once been stored. Today, it would carry something far more dangerous than parchment. Astrid knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission, her arms laden with carefully selected items. The hallkeeper's seal, she said, placing a heavy silver ring on the table. The household ledger showing your management of resources. And this, she produced a folded parchment bearing multiple wax seals. The formal document appointing you to your position, signed by Lord Hrolf and witnessed by the village elders. Perfect, Brynhild said, examining each item carefully. These will be crucial for establishing the legitimacy of my authority when the moment comes. Are you certain about this plan? Astrid asked, her voice tight with worry. The risks are enormous. If Thorkel suspects what you're attempting, if he decides to simply eliminate the threat you pose, rather than playing out his political theater, then I'll die, Brynhild said simply. But I'll die as the hallkeeper of Bjornheim, not as a powerless exile begging for mercy, and my death will expose him for what he truly is. It was a sobering calculation, but one that brought her unexpected peace. For months, she had defined herself by what others had taken from her. Now she would define herself by what she chose to risk, by the stand she decided to make when all other options had been exhausted. A commotion in the courtyard announced Thorkel's arrival. Through her window, Brynhild watched as the man himself rode through Bjornheim's gates at the head of an impressive column of warriors. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40 summers, with the kind of controlled intensity that marked natural leaders. His horse was magnificent, a black stallion that moved with predatory grace, and his armor was the finest she had ever seen, each piece crafted by master smiths and polished to mirror brightness. But it was his banner that made her breath catch. Alongside his own colors, he flew the symbol of the Assembly of Jarls, the ancient raven that represented the highest authority in their lands. The message was unmistakable. He came not as an individual seeking private justice, but as the representative of established order itself. "Impressive theater," Gunnar observed, joining her at the window. "He understands the importance of symbols and spectacle." "Good," Brynhild replied. "That means he'll want an audience for what comes next. The larger the audience, the better our chances of success." Below in the courtyard, Thorkel was greeting Bjorn Ravenson and receiving reports from his various subordinates. His manner was calm and professional, that of a commander coordinating a complex operation rather than a man driven by personal vendetta. It confirmed Brynhild's suspicions about the calculated nature of his campaign. Hrolf emerged from the hall to meet his visitors, flanked by his own warriors but clearly outnumbered. The contrast was deliberate. Thorkel wanted everyone present to understand the futility of resistance, the wisdom of accepting his authority gracefully. "Lord Hrolf," Thorkel called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I come bearing the authority of the Assembly of Jarls and a peaceful resolution to recent difficulties." "You are welcome in Bjornheim," Hrolf replied, his tone scrupulously correct. "Though I confess confusion about what difficulties require the Assembly's intervention." Thorkel dismounted with fluid grace and approached with the confident stride of a man who held all the advantageous cards. "The difficulties surrounding your harboring of a woman who fled lawful family authority and your elevation of that woman to a position that defies traditional order. These matters have caused concern among the Assembly's members. I see no lawlessness in offering shelter to a widow in need," Hrolf responded, "nor in recognizing the capabilities of someone qualified to serve my household." "Qualified by what authority?" Thorkel asked, his voice sharpening slightly. "What court examined her fitness? What family approved her appointment? What traditional law supports placing a woman of questionable status in a position of household authority?" It was a masterful attack, framed in terms of law and tradition rather than personal animosity. Thorkel was presenting himself as the defender of proper order against dangerous innovation, making Hrolf appear to be the one defying established customs. "The authority of a Jarl within his own territory," Hrolf replied. "The same authority that allows other men to make decisions about their households without external interference." "Ah," Thorkel said with satisfaction, "but that authority is not absolute. It exists within the framework of traditional law, and when it conflicts with that framework, the Assembly must intervene. Surely you recognize the wisdom of such limits." The trap was beautifully constructed. If Hrolf acknowledged the Assembly's authority to intervene, he undermined his own position. If he rejected it, he placed himself in opposition to traditional order itself. Either way, Thorkel gained ground. This was the moment Brynhild had been waiting for. She emerged from the hall with measured dignity, wearing the formal robes of her office and bearing the symbols of her authority. The silver pendant at her throat caught the morning light, and the hall-keeper's seal gleamed on her finger. She moved not as a supplicant seeking mercy, but as an official representative of Bjornheim's government. "Jarl Thorkel," she said with a respectful bow that acknowledged his rank without suggesting submission. "I am Brynhild Magnusdottir, hall-keeper of this territory. I understand there are questions about my appointment and authority." Thorkel's eyes fixed on her with calculating interest. This was not the broken woman he had expected to find, and she could see him reassessing his approach in real time. "Indeed there are," he replied carefully. "Questions that go to the heart of proper order and traditional authority." "Then perhaps those questions should be answered before the proper audience," Brynhild said, gesturing to the assembled warriors and servants who had gathered to witness the confrontation. You have brought representatives of multiple territories, men who can carry word of what transpires here back to their own jarls. Surely such witnesses deserve to hear the full truth of these matters. It was a subtle challenge, wrapped in the language of respectful cooperation. By suggesting that the witnesses deserved the full truth, she was implying that they had not yet heard it. By emphasizing their role as representatives who would carry word back to other territories, she was reminding Thorkel that his actions here would be judged by the very people whose support he hoped to maintain. "The truth is simple enough," Thorkel replied, but there was a hint of wariness in his voice now. "You fled lawful family authority after your husband's death. You rejected the proper arrangements made for your care and support. You took refuge here and accepted a position that violates traditional understanding of women's roles and family obligations. And yet," Brynhild said, her voice carrying clearly to every witness present, "none of those statements are actually true." The courtyard fell silent, except for the stamping of horses and the whisper of wind through the bare branches of winter trees. Thorkel's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "Explain," he commanded, but his tone had lost some of its authority. "I did not flee family authority," Brynhild said, producing the household ledgers from beneath her cloak. "I was cast out without cause, despite my legal rights as a widow. I did not reject proper arrangements. No proper arrangements were offered. I was given a single night to take what I could carry and leave everything else behind." She held up the ledgers so that all could see them. "These documents record my management of my late husband's household for over 40 years. They show my qualifications for the position I now hold, qualifications earned through decades of successful service." Thorkel's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Family decisions about inheritance and support are internal matters. They do not require external validation." "True," Brynhild agreed, "but they also do not require external enforcement. If my husband's family chose to cast me out, that was their right. But having exercised that right, they cannot then claim authority over where I choose to go or what positions I choose to accept." She stepped forward, her voice growing stronger as she pressed her advantage. "Unless, of course, the casting out was itself part of a larger plan. Unless the goal was never to be rid of an unwanted burden, but to create a political weapon that could be used against a neighboring jarl." Murmurs rippled through the assembled witnesses as the implications of her words sank in. Thorkel's face flushed with anger, but he was trapped by his own insistence on public proceedings. "That is a serious accusation," he said carefully. "Yes," Brynhild replied, "it is, and I have evidence to support it." She touched the silver pendant at her throat, feeling the weight of the documents hidden within its secret compartment. Magnus's final letter, copies of correspondence between Olaf and Thorkel, records that would prove the conspiracy she was alleging, but she would not reveal them yet. The moment had to be perfect, the audience properly prepared, the trap fully set. Thorkel still believed he controlled this confrontation, still thought he could navigate his way to the triumphant conclusion he had planned. Soon, he would discover just how wrong he was. The hallkeeper's seal felt warm on her finger as she prepared for the final gambit of the most dangerous game she had ever played. The confrontation reached its crucial moment as Thorkel struggled to regain control of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. His face had hardened into the mask of authority, but Brynhild could see the calculation behind his eyes as he weighed his options. He had not expected her to fight back with such precision, had not anticipated that she would turn his own public theatre against him. "Evidence," he said, his voice carrying a note of dismissive confidence. "What evidence could a grieving widow possibly possess about matters of high politics? Grief sometimes creates elaborate fantasies, makes people see conspiracies where only unfortunate circumstances exist. It was a skillful deflection, designed to cast doubt on her mental state while appearing sympathetic to her losses. But Brynhild had anticipated this line of attack, had prepared for the attempt to portray her as an unreliable witness to her own experiences. "The evidence of Magnus himself," she replied, her hand moving to the silver pendant. Written in his own hand, sealed with his own seal, and witnessed by men whose honor none here would question. She opened the pendant's hidden compartment with practiced ease, withdrawing a scroll that bore the unmistakable marks of formal documentation. The wax seal was intact, the parchment bore the signs of careful preservation, and the witnesses' marks were clearly visible to all who cared to examine them. My husband suspected that his death would be used as an opportunity for political maneuvering, Brynhild continued, unrolling the document so that key passages were visible to the assembled crowd. He took precautions to ensure that the truth would survive him. Thorkel's confident expression flickered as he recognized the potential threat. A dying man's formal accusations, properly witnessed and legally sealed, would carry enormous weight with any court or assembly. If Magnus had indeed documented a conspiracy, if he had connected Thorkel to his wife's eventual exile, then the entire foundation of the current accusations would crumble. Convenient, Thorkel said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. A document that appears just when needed, making claims that cannot be verified because the author is dead. But the author is not the only source, Brynhild said smoothly. Magnus was careful to document everything he suspected, including correspondence he intercepted and conversations he overheard. Names, dates, specific arrangements, all preserved for examination by those qualified to judge their authenticity. She was bluffing partially, stretching the truth of what Magnus had actually recorded, but the documents she possessed contained enough genuine evidence to support her broader claims. More importantly, Thorkel could not be certain what proof she might have without examining the documents himself, and demanding to do so would acknowledge their potential legitimacy. Even if such documents exist, Thorkel said, his tone growing more aggressive, they prove nothing about current circumstances. A sick man's suspicions about future possibilities are not evidence of actual wrongdoing. True, Brynhild agreed, which is why I also have evidence of more recent communications. This was the moment of greatest risk, the point where her strategy could either triumph completely or collapse into disaster. She withdrew a second document from the pendant's compartment, a letter she had found among Magnus's papers, one that had been carefully preserved and contained correspondence between Olaf and Thorkel, discussing the timing of her exile. This letter, she said, holding it high enough for all to see, details the coordination between my late husband's brother and Jarl Thorkel regarding the specific circumstances of my departure from my former home. It discusses the political advantages that could be gained by ensuring I became a burden on neighboring territories. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of the witnessing warriors stepped closer, their expressions shifting from polite attention to intense interest. The representatives from other territories began murmuring among themselves, recognizing the implications of what she was revealing. Thorkel's face had gone pale, though whether from anger or recognition of danger, Brynhild could not tell. You speak of documents that I have not examined, making claims based on papers that could be forgeries created for this very purpose. Then examine them, Brynhild challenged, extending the documents toward him. Call upon the scribes and scholars among your men to verify the seals, the ink, the parchment itself. Test every aspect of their authenticity before these witnesses who can carry word of your thoroughness back to their own jarls. It was a perfect trap. If Thorkel accepted the challenge and the documents proved authentic, his entire case would collapse publicly and dramatically. If he refused to examine them, he would appear to fear what they might reveal. Either choice undermined his position, but refusing examination was the safer option. It left room for later maneuvering and avoided immediate catastrophe. I need not examine forgeries to recognize their nature, Thorkel said, but his voice lacked conviction. No amount of manufactured evidence can change the fundamental facts of this situation. And what facts are those? Brynhild asked, pressing her advantage. That a widow sought shelter and was offered a position based on her qualifications. That a jarl exercised his traditional authority within his own territory. or that certain men found it convenient to manufacture a crisis that would justify their interference in others' affairs. The accusations hung in the cold air like drawn swords, impossible to ignore and dangerous to address directly. Thorkel had been maneuvered into a position where any response would damage his carefully constructed narrative, but silence would be equally damaging. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with warmth, as if Magnus's spirit was lending her strength for the final phase of the confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the balance of power in the entire region. Thorkel's response revealed the true nature of the man beneath the political facade. When cornered, when his carefully laid plans began to unravel, the mask of lawful authority slipped to reveal something far more dangerous and desperate. "Enough," he snarled, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "I did not come here to debate the fantasies of a bitter woman or to examine documents of questionable origin. I came with the Assembly's authority to restore proper order, and that authority does not require the approval of those who benefit from disorder." The threat was unmistakable, but it was also exactly what Brynhild had hoped to provoke. By abandoning legal justification in favor of naked force, Thorkel was revealing the true foundation of his position. The representatives from other territories were witnessing a man who claimed to defend traditional law while threatening to ignore it when convenient. So, the Assembly's authority extends to refusing examination of evidence? Brynhild asked, her voice carrying clearly to every witness present. "It includes the right to determine truth without investigation, to condemn without trial." "The Assembly's authority," Thorkel replied through gritted teeth, "extends to whatever measures are necessary to preserve stability and order." "Whose stability?" Hrolf interjected, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had intensified. "Whose order? You speak of the Assembly's will, but I wonder if the Assembly truly understands what is being done in its name." It was a devastating question, one that struck at the heart of Thorkel's legitimacy. The Assembly had granted him authority based on his representation of the situation. But if that representation was false, if the Assembly had been deceived about the true nature of the crisis, then his authority became meaningless. Thorkel's face flushed with rage. But before he could respond, one of the witnessing warriors stepped forward. He wore the colors of Jarl Erik Bloodaxe, and his presence among the witnesses suddenly took on new significance. "I am Ragnar Eriksson," the man announced, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for his lord. "I came here to observe and report back to my father about these proceedings. What I have witnessed troubles me greatly." The courtyard fell silent as all present recognized the weight of this intervention. Jarl Erik was one of the most powerful and respected leaders in the region, and his son's words would carry enormous influence with the Assembly. "I have heard accusations made without supporting evidence," Ragnar continued. "I have seen demands for submission without proper justification. Most troubling, I have witnessed the rejection of offered evidence without examination, a practice that violates every principle of Norse law and tradition." Thorkel turned to face this new challenge, but his position was becoming increasingly untenable. "Young Ragnar, you see only the surface of these matters. There are complexities. I see a Jarl threatening to use force rather than address evidence that challenges his claims." Ragnar interrupted. "I see a man who speaks of the Assembly's authority while acting in ways that would horrify the Assembly if they were properly informed." The tide of the confrontation had shifted decisively. What had begun as Thorkel's moment of triumph was becoming a public examination of his methods and motives. The other witnesses were now openly discussing what they had observed, and their conversations carried an increasingly critical tone. Brynhild seized the moment to deliver her final stroke. Perhaps Jarl Thorkel would prefer to return to the Assembly with a full report of today's proceedings. I'm certain they would be interested to learn how their authority was exercised, how evidence was treated, and how traditional law was respected. The suggestion was simultaneously respectful and devastating. By proposing that Thorkel report back to the assembly, she was giving him a face-saving exit, while also ensuring that his conduct would be scrutinized by the very body whose authority he claimed to represent. Or perhaps, she continued, he would prefer to examine the evidence properly, before witnesses who can attest to the thoroughness and fairness of the investigation. Thorkel stood frozen, caught between equally unacceptable alternatives. To retreat would be to acknowledge the weakness of his position, but to continue would be to risk complete exposure of his conspiracy. The silver pendant containing Magnus's letters seemed to gleam mockingly in the morning light, holding secrets that could destroy him entirely. The choice is yours. Jarl Thorkel, Brynhild said with quiet dignity. Act as the defender of law and order you claim to be, or reveal yourself as something else entirely. The moment stretched taut as winter wind. 50 armed men waiting for their lord's decision. Witnesses from multiple territories poised to carry word of what transpired to every corner of the land. Thorkel's hand remained on his sword hilt, but his eyes showed the trapped desperation of a predator suddenly finding itself prey. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the bitter edge of a man who had gambled everything and lost. This matter is not concluded. The assembly will hear of today's defiance, and justice will be served. But even as he spoke the words, everyone present could hear the hollow ring of defeat in them. The silver pendant had done its work. Magnus's final gift to his beloved wife had secured her victory, and Thorkel's carefully constructed campaign lay in ruins around him. 3 months later, spring had transformed Bjornheim into a place of renewal and promise. The carved raven chest in Brynhild's chamber now held correspondence from jarls throughout the region, letters seeking her counsel on matters of household management, legal disputes, and the delicate art of political navigation. The reputation she had gained during the confrontation with Thorkel had spread far beyond the borders of Hrolf's territory. The silver pendant rested in a place of honor atop the chest, no longer needed to conceal desperate secrets, but cherished as a reminder of Magnus's love and foresight. Beside it lay a new addition, a formal document bearing the seals of the Assembly of Jarls, officially recognizing her position as hallkeeper and establishing her authority to speak for Bjornheim in certain legal matters. It was an unprecedented recognition of a woman's political authority, born from the necessity of acknowledging what she had already proven herself capable of achieving. Thorkel's retreat had been swift, but not without consequences. The Assembly's investigation into his conduct had revealed the full scope of his conspiracy with Olaf, leading to formal censure and the stripping of his authority to act in the Assembly's name. More importantly, several other jarls had come forward with their own stories of Thorkel's attempts at manipulation and political pressure, painting a picture of systematic abuse of traditional law for personal gain. Olaf had fared even worse. When the truth of his collaboration came to light, Magnus's other relatives had risen in outrage, stripping him of the property he had seized and formally exiling him from their lands. The farm that had been Brynhild's home for 40 years was now managed by Magnus's cousin, a man who had sent word that she would always be welcome to return if she chose. But Bjornheim had become her true home, and her work here had grown beyond anything she had imagined when she first accepted Hrolf's offer of shelter. The hall thrived under her management, but more than that, it had become a center of innovation in the treatment of women and the management of family disputes. Jarls sent their daughters to learn household management under her guidance, and she had begun developing new approaches to the legal questions that arose when traditional customs failed to address changing circumstances. On this particular spring morning, she stood in the great hall, overseeing preparations for a wedding feast. Astrid had indeed returned to her husband's farm, but she was marrying him again in a ceremony that celebrated their reunion and the new life they were building together. It was a joyous occasion that had drawn guests from throughout the region, many of whom had come as much to See the famous hallkeeper, as to celebrate the young couple. Hrolf approached with the easy familiarity of a partnership that had deepened into genuine friendship over the months of working together. He carried a drinking horn carved with intricate knotwork, a gift he planned to present to the bride and groom. The Eastern Jarls have sent their responses to your proposal about the women's assembly, he said, offering her a scroll sealed with multiple ribbons. The initial reactions are more positive than I expected. Brynhild accepted the scroll with satisfaction. The Women's Assembly was her most ambitious project, a formal body that would provide counsel on matters affecting women and families, with the authority to investigate disputes and recommend solutions to the traditional all-male assemblies. It was a radical concept, but the events of the past months had demonstrated the need for new approaches to old problems. Change comes slowly, she said, breaking the seals and scanning the contents. But it comes. Each woman who stands up for herself makes it easier for the next one to do the same. Through the hall's open doors, they could see the wedding guests arriving in the courtyard. Among them was Ragnar Eriksson, now a regular visitor who had become one of Brynhild's strongest supporters in her various reforms. His father, Jarl Erik, had proven to be an unexpected ally in her efforts to establish new precedents for women's authority and legal standing. "There's something else," Hrolf said, his tone becoming more serious. "A message arrived this morning from the Northern Territories. It seems your reputation has reached King Harald himself. He's requesting that you attend the Summer Assembly to provide counsel on new laws regarding inheritance and women's rights." The invitation was extraordinary, a recognition that transcended anything Brynhild had dared to hope for. To be summoned by the king himself, to have her voice heard in the formation of laws that would affect countless women throughout the realm. It was a responsibility that both thrilled and humbled her. "Will you go?" Hrolf asked. Brynhild looked around the hall that had become her sanctuary and her platform for change. The bronze brooch at her shoulder caught the light from the windows, reminding her of her grandmother's strength and the long line of women who had faced their own impossible choices with courage and determination. "Yes," she said simply, "but I'll return. This is my home now, and there's still work to be done here." The wedding feast that followed was a celebration not just of Astrid's happiness, but of all the changes that had transformed Bjornheim over the past year. As Brynhild raised her drinking horn in toast after toast, she felt the profound satisfaction of a life rebuilt on her own terms, of authority earned rather than inherited, of respect commanded rather than demanded. When the last guest had departed and the hall had been restored to order, she climbed the stairs to her chamber and opened the carved raven chest one final time before sleep. Inside, alongside the correspondence and documents that marked her new life, she placed the wedding ring that had once been too loose on her finger. It fit perfectly now, not because her body had changed, but because she had grown into herself completely. The woman who had stumbled into Bjornheim as a desperate exile was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to fight for it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the boundaries of what was possible for women in their world. But tonight, she was simply Brynhild Magnusdóttir, hallkeeper of Bjornheim, keeper of her own destiny, and architect of a future that would be kinder to those who came after her. The carved raven on the chest seemed to spread its wings wider in the candlelight, ready to carry her dreams forward into whatever storms might come.